Nepal has seen 32 fatal accidents since 2000. Over the skies of Pokhara, First Officer Anju is on her penultimate trip before becoming a captain. She is 5 minutes away from landing, but she is using an approach she has never flown before. Her teacher is with her in the cockpit, advising and monitoring her performance. Everything was going well until a caution appeared in the cockpit. The plane has just lost power, the engines have become sluggish, and the aircraft is dropping height. They are only 500 feet above the earth, and the runway is only a minute away. She increases the power lever, nothing. Pushes it to its maximum, nothing. The senior pilot quickly takes over control. The jet continues to descend. They can see the runway. Nevertheless, the plane begins to bank to the left at this point. Will the 72 people on board this jet arrive safely? Or will this be another dark mark on Nepal's already terrible aviation record? Let us find out. This is the account of Yati Airlines Flight 691. It's a gorgeous sunny day in Kathmandu, Nepal's capital. And today is an exciting day for First Officer Anju Katiwara, since she will become Captain Katiwara at the end of the day. And it would be a dream come true. She was trained as a nurse, but she opted to pursue a career in aviation when her husband, Captain Deepak Pokhrel, was killed in a plane crash in Nepal in 2006. 4 years after Deepak's death, she traveled to the United States to train as a pilot. In 2010, she returned to Nepal to work for Yati Airlines, where her husband had previously flown. She is one of just 6 female pilots hired by the airline and has more than 6,400 hours of experience. Anju was joined in the cockpit by Senior Captain Kamal KC. He had around 22,000 hours of flight experience and joined Yati Airlines in 2009. He often does the final examination before a pilot is promoted, and that is why he is on this airplane today. Her flights today are from Kathmandu to Pokhara. Pokhara is Nepal's second most populous city. It is an exceptionally attractive urban city in the heart of Nepal, and it has recently emerged as the country's tourism hub. It serves as the gateway to the Annapurna mountain range in the Himalayas. Hence, it is popular with international tourists. To accommodate these tourists, a new international airport was built between 2016 and 2022. The airport opened barely 2 weeks earlier, on New Year's Day, 2023. Now let's get acquainted with Pokhara. Kathmandu is around 150 kilometers away in this direction. The new airport was built just 3 kilometers to the east of an existing airport. The runway has 2 ends, runways 12 and 30. Planes flying in from Kathmandu typically land on runway 30 for a straight-in approach. Runway 12 lacked a published visual approach. Yati Airlines had developed one internally, in which planes flew clear of the mountains by making tight rotations and flying at a lower altitude. This did not match the criteria for a stable visual approach. The aircraft for today's flight was an ATR 72500. This is a turboprop regional airliner designed for short-distance flights. This plane was 16 years old, having previously operated for India's Kingfisher Airlines and Thailand's Nok Air before being sold to Yati in 2019. It's a workhorse and a very reliable plane, and this particular one was in good working order. Today, First Officer Anju and Captain Kamal had 2 round flights to Pokhara planned. The flight from Kathmandu to Pokhara is 26 minutes long. Since First Officer Anju was on her check ride, she sat in the commander's left seat, while Captain Kamal sat in the right. During the first flight, as they approached Pokhara, ATC awarded them runway 30, and they landed safely. After 30 minutes, the jet recrossed the border, refueled, and taxied to the runway. The flight took off from Pokhara and landed safely in Kathmandu 26 minutes later. The next leg will be the incident flight. Anju was 30 minutes away from achieving her 100 hours of flight service and becoming captain. All that was required was to fly this flight from Kathmandu back to Pokhara and land safely. Ocean Magar, a flight attendant, prepares the cabin for the journey. She's also a popular Nepali speaker, and she created and shared a delightful video with her admirers. The passengers began boarding the plane, and among the 72 passengers was a group of 4 Indian tourists who were live streaming their flight on Facebook. In the cockpit, the 2 pilots are getting ready for the journey. Now let's have a short glance at the center console. It is going to play a role in the situation today. On the left, there is a lever that controls the speed, emergency, and parking brakes. Next to it are the power levers. There is a flap switch all the way to the right. It's formed like a small wing. There is also a condition lever located between the power and flap levers. And to find out what it does, let's get out of the plane. The ATR is a turboprop aircraft. It generates thrust using these large fans. And to understand how this works, let's start with the wing. Now, in the previous video, I demonstrated how a wing functions. But to summarize, the top of the wing is bent. The wind that flows over the wing, because the top of the wing is curved, must go a longer distance, resulting in a low pressure zone. The bottom of the wing has more pressure, which pushes or raises the plane in this direction. So this is now an upward force. But I need the plane to head in this direction. Simply rotate the wing 90 degrees like this. But how can I direct the wind to flow over the wings in this orientation? When it is in its regular configuration, the plane accelerating down the runway causes the wind to flow over it. But that won't help here. Here's a front view of that wing. Maybe I could spin the wing like this to give the same effect as the wind flowing over it. Nice. So there's a low pressure area to the right and a high pressure area to the left. This provides a force that pushes the wing in this direction. Now I don't want to manually rotate this wing forever. So let me add, this turbine will keep this wing rotating for me. So, what if I wanted greater thrust? I need a higher pressure differential, so I'll just add additional wings. So now, there is a considerably lower pressure zone here. There's a significantly higher pressure area here, resulting in a greater force in this direction. Does this seem familiar? The propellers are basically tiny wings that create lift in the forward direction. However, there are occasions during a flight when you do not want to create any additional momentum. Let's say during taxi, or let's say when there is an engine failure and you need to glide the plane a long distance. If the propellers are in their normal position, it will create unnecessary drag. So in order to reduce the drag, you can feather the propellers, basically turning it in the direction of the wind so that the difference in pressure is removed. And going back to the additional lever in the cockpit, this lever is used to feather the propellers. When the lever is in the forward position, the propeller generates thrust. And when the lever is in the back position, the propellers are feathered, thus not creating forward momentum. Now, let us return to our story. We are at Tribhuvan International Airport in Kathmandu. and the team has just completed one circuit to Pokhara and is preparing for the second leg of the day. At 10:20 a.m. local time, the plane pushed back and began taxiing to the runway. Flight 691 then departed Tribhuvan International Airport at 10:32 a.m. local time. After flying over the picturesque Himalayan highlands and 15 miles from the airport, they gained contact with Pokhara ATC. The ATC approved them for a straight-in approach on runway 30, which they had completed a few hours earlier on the day's first flight. But, as this was her familiarization trip, Captain Kamal wanted to ensure that First Officer Anju was also familiar with the runway 12 approach. So they requested a runway 12 approach, and ATC approved it. Remember that this approach has not been certified by the Nepal Aviation Authority. The team has also not been taught in this method. The tight aspect of the approach will further increase the crew's workload. The plane reached the apex of its fall at 10:51 a.m., traveling at 6,500 feet and approximately 5 miles from the airport. First Officer Anju set the power lever to flying idle. The plane began to descend. When the speed reached 180 knots, First Officer Anju requested flaps 15. Captain Kamal set the flaps to 15. At 170 knots, Captain Kamal lowered the gear. They completed the crosswind leg and turned left to begin the downhill stretch. The weather was clear, and ATC could visually identify the jet. At 10.56-27, the pilot monitoring turned off the autopilot while at an altitude of 721 feet. 5 seconds later, the plane reached 100 knots. The pilot flew at 150 knots and requested flaps 30. Captain Kamal is currently conducting 3 separate duties. He is doing the role of pilot monitoring. He is also instructing and coaching First Officer Anju, and he is developing a totally new tight method that has only been used twice before. He is under enormous workload strain. The pilot called for flaps 30. The pilot monitoring acknowledged flaps 30 and descent. Unfortunately, instead of moving the flaps lever to 30, Captain Kamal incorrectly adjusted the condition lever to the feathered position. Remember that when the condition lever is moved to this position, the propellers become feathered and no longer generate forward velocity. Neither propeller is now generating thrust. Captain Kamal exclaims, "He hasn't realized he's moved the wrong lever." 5 seconds later, the master caution chime reverberated across the cockpit. The buzz from the engines shifted. There was no longer forward thrust from the plane. She moved the power lever from 41% to 44%. I am not receiving enough power. The aircraft starts to lose altitude. They are only 500 feet off the earth, and the runway is fairly close. It's only 1 minute away. She raises the power lever. Nothing. Pushes it to its limits. Nothing. The senior pilot instantly assumes control. The plane keeps descending. Captain Kamal scanned the instruments for faults. Notice that the flaps lever was set to 15 instead of 30. So he set it to 30. Unfortunately, the workload in the cockpit is so high that there is no indication that the condition lever is in the wrong position. The flaps increased to 30. With little power produced, flaps 30 exacerbated the problem by increasing the plane's drag. 4 seconds later, the stick shaker began shaking, signaling an impending stall. The left wing was moving so slowly that it halted. The right wing was still producing lift, and this put a rotational force on the plane, causing it to bank sharply to the left. The pilots had run out of options. At 1057.32, the plane crashed in a canyon near the Sethi Gandaki River. This disaster claimed the lives of First Officer Anju, Captain Kamal, Flight Attendant Ocean Nagar, and 69 others. There were no survivors. 4 Indian visitors were live broadcasting the landing from the passenger cabin, and the video continued to play during the disaster.